An old soldier cast out onto the streets, a loyal but ailing dog facing the threat of being put down, and a promise that seemed lost to time. But when a wealthy man stepped out of a luxury car and shouted, "Reinforcements have arrived," the entire poor neighborhood fell silent. What truth had been buried for 3 long years? And what did Cooper the dog do on that stormy night to change the fate of all 3 of them? This story of dignity and gratitude might just restore your faith in humanity. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The iron graveyard of Detroit sprawled under a relentless steel-gray sky, a labyrinth of rusted car carcasses and twisted metal groaning in the biting wind that smelled of oil and decay. In the furthest corner, overshadowed by a mountain of crushed sedans, stood a solitary shipping container, its corrugated sides painted a defiant, clean navy blue amidst the sea of oxidation, acting as the only beacon of order in a chaotic world. Inside that steel box lived Jack, a man whose exterior was as weathered and hardened as the scrap surrounding him. At 52, Jack carried the permanent etchings of a life lived on the edge. His face was a roadmap of deep lines carved by desert suns and sleepless nights, with a square, stubbled jaw that set firmly against the world. His hair, once a vibrant brown, was now a cropped, military-style crew cut of steel gray, matching the piercing eyes that seemed to constantly scan for threats even in the safety of his home. He moved with a distinctive, rhythmic limp in his left leg, a permanent souvenir from an IED explosion in Fallujah that had taken his meniscus and his military career, but never his discipline. Jack wore a pair of charcoal coveralls that, despite being stained with grease, were pressed with razor-sharp creases, a testament to a code of conduct that didn't dissolve just because his paycheck did. Beside him lay Cooper, a massive German shepherd, 10 years old and carrying the scars of service just like his master. His black and tan coat was thick, but his muzzle was frosted with the white hairs of age, and he stood with a slight stiffness in his hips, a silent mirror to Jack's own pain. The morning routine was a ritual of survival. Jack woke at 500 hours without an alarm. He folded his thin wool blanket with precise corners, smoothing out every wrinkle until the cot looked ready for inspection. The container was small but organized with surgical precision. Tools hung in descending order of size, and the smell of WD-40 filled the air, a scent Jack found more comforting than any expensive cologne. He brewed strong, bitter coffee on a hot plate, pouring a splash of water into Cooper's bowl first. Today was collection day, and the knot in Jack's stomach tightened as the aggressive crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the landlord. Vance stepped out of his pristine white SUV like a king visiting his peasants. He was a man in his late 40s who wore his greed like a second skin, with a thickening midsection straining the buttons of a flashy, pinstriped suit that looked ridiculous in a junkyard. His hair was slicked back with too much gel, revealing a forehead perpetually shiny with sweat, and his beady eyes darted around, calculating value but never seeing worth. He grimaced as his polished loafers touched the mud. "Jack," he said, his voice deceptively smooth but laced with venom. "That pile of alternators. You're slow today." Jack stepped out, Cooper flanking him instantly. The dog let out a low, vibrating growl, the hair on his neck standing up, but a subtle hand signal from Jack silenced him. Cooper sat, trembling with the urge to protect, but obeying the command. "I'm on it, Vance," Jack replied, his voice a low rumble. "Just finishing the sorting." Vance sneered, walking close enough to invade Jack's personal space. He didn't shout. Instead, he smiled a cruel, thin smile. "Don't forget, Jack," Vance whispered, leaning in. "Nobody else hires broken goods. You think the world wants a limping soldier with a half-dead dog? I'm doing you a charity keeping you here." He pointed a manicured finger at Jack's chest. "Copper prices are fluctuating. I'm cutting your cut by 5% this week. Consider it a rental adjustment." Jack's jaw tightened, the muscle feathering as he swallowed the rage. He needed this place. Cooper needed a roof. "Understood," Jack said, his eyes cold as flint. Vance drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation. Jack exhaled slowly, resting his hand on Cooper's head. "It's okay, buddy. We hold the line," he whispered. But the day had work to do. By mid-morning, the customers began to arrive, the people Vance didn't see. First was Sarah, an elderly woman from the adjacent housing projects. She was a wisp of a woman, fragile as a dried leaf, with skin like crinkled parchment and a cloud of snow-white hair. Her hands shook with the tremors of Parkinson's, and she wore a faded shawl wrapped tight around her hunched shoulders. She pushed a rusted wheelchair that squeaked agonizingly. "Mr. Jack," she whispered, shame coloring her cheeks. "It's the brake again. I can't lift my husband if it rolls." Jack knelt immediately, ignoring the sharp protest of his own knee. He inspected the chair. The tension spring was snapped. It was a specific part, hard to find. Jack looked back at his workbench. There, sitting on a rag, was a vintage carburetor he had spent 3 nights restoring. He had a buyer lined up for it. $50. $50 meant a refill of Cooper's arthritis medicine. Jack looked at the carburetor, then at Sarah's trembling hands, then at Cooper, who was gently nudging Sarah's leg to comfort her. Without a word, Jack walked to the bench, dismantled the carburetor, and ripped out the pristine spring inside. He destroyed his $50 sale in seconds. He installed it into the wheelchair. "Try it now, Sarah," he said gently. The brake clicked shut, solid and safe. Sarah tried to press a crumpled dollar into his hand. "No." Jack closed her fingers over the bill. "Keep it." The part was lying around. As the afternoon light faded, a group of local kids ran up the dirt path, led by Leo, a 10-year-old with scuffed knees and a gap-toothed grin that defied the poverty of his surroundings. Leo pushed a bicycle with a cracked frame. "Mr. Jack, can you fix it?" Leo asked, eyes wide. Cooper thumped his tail, allowing the children to swarm him. Jack pulled down his welding mask. "Stand back," he ordered, his voice stern but kind. As he worked, the blue arc of the welder lighting up the gloom, Leo pointed at Jack's leg. "Does it hurt?" the boy asked innocently. "The war?" Jack paused, the welding torch hissing in his hand. He looked at the boy, then at the gray sky. "Only when I stop moving, kid," he replied softly. "That's why we keep working." He fixed the bike, reinforcing the frame stronger than it was when it was new. He couldn't fix his own broken life, but he could ensure a kid's bike didn't break. By evening, the wind howled through the stacks of metal. Jack finished his shift, his body aching bone deep. He had lost money today. He had lost dignity with Vance. But as he went to close the container doors, he looked down. On the wooden pallet, someone had left a small plastic bag. Inside were 3 ripe bananas and a small bag of white rice. No note, just a silent offering from the ghosts of the neighborhood, Sarah, or maybe Leo's mom. Jack picked it up, the yellow fruit bright against the gray world. He looked at Cooper. "We eat tonight, Coop," he whispered, a lump forming in his throat. Vance had the money, Vance had the power, but Jack had this. He locked the door against the cold, feeling the warmth of the bananas in his rough hand, a tiny, defiant reminder that even in a graveyard of iron, humanity could still bloom. The blizzard did not arrive with a whisper. It slammed into Detroit like a freight train made of ice and fury, burying the scrapyard under a suffocating blanket of white. By 200 hours, the temperature had plummeted to a bone-cracking 5 degrees below zero, and the wind howled around the corners of the shipping container with the shrieking intensity of a banshee, rattling the corrugated steel walls as if trying to tear Jack's metal sanctuary apart. Inside, the small space usually held heat well, but tonight the cold was a physical weight, seeping through the floorboards and frosting the edges of the single window. Jack lay on his cot, wrapped in his wool blanket and wearing his thermal layers, drifting in and out of a fitful sleep, haunted by the percussion of the storm, which sounded too much like the artillery barrages of his past. He was just slipping into a deeper unconsciousness when the rhythm of the night was shattered not by the wind, but by Cooper. The German shepherd, usually a statue of discipline, who slept silently at the foot of the cot, suddenly bolted upright. A low, guttural whine vibrated in his throat, escalating quickly into a sharp, urgent bark that echoed painfully in the confined space. Jack groaned, rubbing grit from his eyes, and rolled over, his bad knee stiff and aching from the pressure drop. "Stand down, Cooper," Jack rasped, his voice thick with sleep. "It's just the wind. Secure." But for the first time in 10 years, the command was ignored. Cooper didn't settle. Instead, he began to pace frantically back and forth in the narrow aisle, his claws clicking like frantic metronomes against the floor. He threw himself at the heavy steel door, scratching at the metal with a desperation that Jack had never witnessed. The sound was excruciating, claws against steel, and when Jack turned on the small battery-powered lantern, the beam of light revealed a shocking sight. Cooper's paws were leaving small, dark smears of blood on the doorframe. He was tearing his own nails apart in his panic to get out. Jack was instantly awake, the soldier in him overriding the tired old man. This wasn't a dog needing to relieve himself. This was a Class A alarm. "Easy! Easy, Coop!" Jack commanded, swinging his legs off the cot and wincing as his feet hit the freezing floor. He grabbed his heavy parka and pulled on his boots with trembling hands, his heart rate spiking. Cooper was now throwing his entire 80-pound body against the latch, letting out a howl that wasn't aggressive, but mournful, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress that made the hair on Jack's arms stand up. Jack unlatched the door, and the wind ripped it from his grip, slamming it against the outer wall with a deafening clang. A wall of snow blinded him instantly, but Cooper didn't hesitate. The dog didn't wait for a leash. He launched himself into the white void, disappearing into the swirling darkness. "Cooper, halt!" Jack screamed, his voice swallowed by the gale. He grabbed his high-beam flashlight and plunged into the storm, his left leg dragging through thigh-high drifts that felt like wet concrete. The visibility was zero, a kaleidoscope of white noise and stinging ice crystals. Jack followed the faint, frantic barking ahead, pushing his body past the limit of pain, guided only by the desperate sound of his companion. They weren't heading toward the scrapyard perimeter or the gate. Cooper was leading him toward the desolate stretch of land bordering the old highway drainage ditch, a treacherous area known as the Gully, where the city's runoff froze into jagged black ice. Every step was a battle. Jack fell twice, the cold burning his exposed face, but the barking grew louder, more hysterical. After 200 yards that felt like 10 miles, Jack reached the edge of the ditch. The flashlight beam cut through the snow, illuminating Cooper down below. The dog was digging. He was digging with a manic intensity, sending sprays of snow and frozen mud flying into the air, whining and nudging something dark, half buried in a drift created by the highway plows. Jack slid down the embankment, tearing his coveralls on a hidden piece of rebar, and scrambled to the dog's side. "What is it? What did you find?" Jack yelled, breathless. Cooper stepped back, panting, his muzzle coated in frost and blood, revealing a hand. A human hand. It was pale, blue-tinged, and motionless, protruding from the snow like a piece of discarded marble. Jack's stomach lurched. He thought it was a corpse, another homeless soul claimed by the Detroit winter. He fell to his knees and frantically brushed the snow away, revealing the figure of a young man curled into a fetal position. This was Ryan. He looked painfully young, perhaps 22 or 23, with a fragile, almost aristocratic bone structure that seemed entirely out of place in this industrial wasteland. His skin was translucent with hypothermia, pale as milk, contrasting sharply with the matted, jet-black hair that plastered against his forehead. He wasn't dressed for a storm. He was wearing a tuxedo jacket, expensive silk, now ripped and stained with vomit and mud, over a thin dress shirt that was unbuttoned at the collar, exposing a bruised neck. Beside him lay an empty bottle of amber liquor, the smell of expensive whiskey mixing with the metallic scent of the storm. His lips were cracked and blue, and a fresh cut ran through his eyebrow, caked with frozen blood, suggesting violence before the cold took hold. Jack checked for a pulse. It was there, thready, weak, a fluttering bird against his fingertips. As Jack touched him, the boy's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, hollow, and devoid of fear, filled instead with a terrifying resignation. Ryan looked at Jack, then past him, staring into the void of the storm. "Let me die," he whispered, the words barely audible over the wind, a puff of faint vapor escaping his lips. "Please, just leave me." The plea hit Jack like a physical blow. He recoiled, sitting back on his heels. Fear, cold and rational, flooded his mind. This kid was trouble. Expensive clothes, signs of assault, suicidal. This was police territory. This was questions Jack couldn't answer, scrutiny Vance wouldn't tolerate. If Jack dragged him back and the kid died in the container, Jack would be charged with manslaughter. If he called the cops, they'd find code violations and bulldoze his home. The instinct of self-preservation, honed by years of living on the street, screamed at him. "Walk away. He wants to die. It's not your war." Jack began to stand up, his hand reaching for Cooper's collar to pull the dog away. "We can't, Coop. We can't do this," Jack muttered, his voice cracking with shame. "Come on." But Cooper didn't move. The dog looked at Jack, then at the shivering, dying boy. With a definitive grunt, Cooper lay down. He didn't lie on the snow. He sprawled his massive warm body directly on top of Ryan's chest. He tucked his head under the boy's chin and began to lick the frozen tears from Ryan's face. The dog growled at Jack, a low, warning rumble that Jack had never heard directed at him. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a rebuke. Cooper's amber eyes burned with a fierce, ancient intelligence, judging Jack's hesitation. The dog was using his own body heat to keep the stranger's heart beating, refusing to abandon a pack member, even a temporary one. Ryan's hand, shaking uncontrollably, instinctively buried itself in Cooper's thick fur. The sight broke something hard inside Jack's chest. He saw the humanity in the animal, a pure, uncalculated compassion that Jack had buried under layers of cynicism and survival instincts. He looked at the boy, someone's son, someone's friend, currently nobody's problem but his, and realized he couldn't be the man who walked away. Not tonight. The soldier in him woke up, silencing the coward. Jack gritted his teeth, grabbed Ryan's arm, and hauled him upright. "Not on my watch, kid," Jack grunted, adrenaline masking the agony in his knee, as he hoisted the semi-conscious stranger onto his back, beginning the long, brutal march home. Consciousness returned to Ryan not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent, sickening collision with reality. He woke with a gasp, his body jerking on the narrow cot, his lungs seizing in the frigid air of the container. The first sensation was pain, a throbbing jackhammer rhythm behind his eyes that threatened to split his skull, accompanied by the agonizing tremors of severe alcohol withdrawal. His hands shook uncontrollably as he clawed at the scratchy wool blanket covering him, his skin clammy with cold sweat despite the layers of clothing. For a moment, disoriented by the dim, filtered light seeping through the frosted window, he thought he was in a cell or a coffin. The smell hit him next. A mixture of machine oil, old metal, wet dog, and the stale, sour scent of his own vomit on his ruined tuxedo shirt. Ryan sat up, retching dryly, his stomach empty and cramping. He looked around wildly, his vision blurring. This wasn't the plush, sterile safety of a hospital, or the suffocating velvet of his family's mansion. It was a metal box, a workshop. Tools hung on the walls like instruments of torture in the shadows. Panic, primal and chemically induced, surged through his veins. He needed a drink. He didn't just want it. His cells screamed for it, a physiological imperative that overrode all reason, dignity, or fear. Across the small space, sitting on an overturned crate next to a small electric heater, sat the man from the storm. Jack watched him with the stillness of a stone statue. The old soldier had not slept. His eyes were rimmed with red, and his stubble seemed grayer in the morning light, but his posture was alert, his hands resting on his knees. To Ryan, in his delirious state, Jack looked like a jailer. "Water," Ryan croaked, his voice a jagged shard of glass in his throat. Jack stood up slowly, the movement accompanied by the audible pop of his bad knee, and retrieved a tin mug from a small table. He filled it from a plastic jug and handed it to the boy. Ryan snatched it, spilling half of it down his chin as he drank greedily, but the water only made his stomach recoil. He threw the mug against the metal wall with a clang that rang like a gunshot in the confined space. "I don't want water," Ryan screamed, the sound tearing at his raw throat. I need something to take the edge off. Do you have anything? Whiskey, vodka, rubbing alcohol?" He scrambled off the cot, his legs tangled in the blanket, crashing to the floor. He tried to stand, but his equilibrium was gone. He crawled, frantic, his eyes darting around the organized shelves. "Where is it? You have to have something." Jack didn't move to help him. He watched with a mixture of pity and professional detachment, recognizing the symptoms of a man at war with his own chemistry. "There's no liquor here, son," Jack said, his voice level and calm, a stark contrast to Ryan's hysteria. "This is a dry camp." The denial triggered a rage in Ryan that blinded him. He pulled himself up using the workbench, knocking over a jar of screws that scattered across the floor like metal rain. He swept his arm across the surface, sending wrenches and screwdrivers clattering. "Liar! You're a bum living in a trash heap. Of course you have booze," Ryan yelled, his aristocratic face twisted into a mask of ugly desperation. He began tearing through the drawers, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He found nothing but perfectly organized fuses and washers. Then, his eyes landed on a small wooden box on a high shelf, the only personal item in the room that wasn't a tool. With a desperate lunge, Ryan grabbed it. He opened the lid, his shaking fingers fumbling. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a vintage field watch. It was old, the leather strap worn dark by sweat and time, the glass face scratched, but the casing was silver. It looked valuable, or at least tradable. "This," Ryan panted, clutching the watch. "I can sell this. There's a liquor store on 8th. They'll take it." He turned toward the heavy steel door, the prize clutched to his chest. "Put it back," Jack said. The command wasn't shouted. It was spoken with a quiet, terrifying finality. Jack hadn't moved an inch, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That watch belonged to my father. It survived Omaha Beach. It survived Fallujah. It's not going into a pawn shop for a bottle of cheap gin." Ryan hesitated, looking at the old man. In his mind, Jack was just a crippled scavenger, an obstacle. "Try and stop me, old man," Ryan spat, adrenaline momentarily overriding his weakness. He took a step toward the door. That was when the shadow moved. Cooper, who had been lying silently in the corner, rose. He didn't lunge, he didn't bark. He simply walked to the door and stood in front of it, blocking the exit with his massive 80-pound frame. Ryan froze. He expected the dog to snarl, to bare teeth, to act like the guard dogs Vance kept at the perimeter, beasts of violence. Ryan braced himself for pain, raising his arm to protect his face, but the attack never came. Instead, Cooper just looked at him. The German shepherd's ears were pinned back against his skull, not in aggression, but in a display of profound submission and sadness. His amber eyes, usually sharp and alert, were soft, filled with a confused disappointment that pierced Ryan deeper than any bite could have. Cooper let out a low, high-pitched whine, tilting his head slightly as if asking, "Why are you doing this?" "We saved you." The dog's stiffness, the gray on his muzzle, the way he leaned slightly to favor his arthritic hips, it all radiated a vulnerability that mirrored Ryan's own. Cooper didn't see a thief. He saw a broken pack member turning on his own. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Ryan looked at the door, then at the dog, and finally at the watch in his hand. The adrenaline crashed. The rage evaporated, leaving only a hollow, aching shame. The look in Cooper's eyes stripped Ryan naked, peeling away the layers of entitlement and addiction, leaving him feeling small and wretched. His hand began to tremble so violently he could barely hold the watch. I just, Ryan stammered, his voice breaking. He looked at Jack, who was still watching him, not with anger, but with the weary patience of a man who had seen men break before. Ryan's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, not from physical weakness this time, but from the crushing weight of his own actions. He dropped the watch on the rug, carefully, instinctively avoiding the hard floor, and buried his face in his hands. The sobs that racked his body were ugly, guttural sounds, the release of years of pressure, expectation, and failure. "I'm sorry," he wept, rocking back and forth. "I'm so sorry. I'm no good. I'm just garbage." Cooper moved then. He stepped forward, closing the distance between judge and accused. He lowered his heavy head and rested it on Ryan's shoulder, nudging his wet nose against the boy's ear, offering comfort to the very person who had just threatened them. Jack stood up, the tension leaving his shoulders. He walked over, picked up the watch, and checked it for damage before placing it back in the box. He didn't lecture, he didn't scold. He walked to the hot plate where a small pot had been simmering, filling the room with a faint, savory steam. There was a soft knock on the metal door frame. The door had been left slightly ajar by Cooper's earlier exit. Standing there, shivering in her thin shawl, was Sarah. The elderly neighbor looked even more fragile in the daylight, her skin like translucent paper stretched over brittle bones. She held a plastic container wrapped in a towel. "I heard shouting," she whispered, her voice trembling with Parkinson's and concern. Is he all right?" Jack moved to the door, shielding Ryan's breakdown from view with his body to preserve the boy's dignity. "He's having a hard morning, Sarah, but he's safe." Sarah nodded, her eyes wet. "I brought this. It's rice porridge with a little chicken broth. It's good for the stomach." She handed the container to Jack, her hands shaking so much he had to steady them with his own. Tell him he's welcome here." Jack closed the door and returned to Ryan, who was still huddled on the floor with Cooper. Jack knelt down, a painful process that made him grit his teeth, and placed the warm container on the floor. "Sit up," Jack ordered gently. Ryan wiped his face with his sleeve, looking at the food with confusion. "What is this?" Jack opened the lid. "It's porridge. Sarah made it. You met her yesterday, the lady with the wheelchair." Ryan stared at the steam rising from the bowl. "Why?" he whispered. "I tried to steal from you. I'm a mess." Jack picked up the spoon. "Sarah collects cans. She walks 5 miles a day to make enough money to buy basic groceries. That rice, that broth, that represents about 4 hours of her walking in the cold." Jack's eyes locked onto Ryan's. "She heard you screaming, and her first thought wasn't to call the cops. It was to feed you. She spent her day's earnings on this bowl for a stranger." Jack pressed the spoon into Ryan's hand. "You think you're garbage? You think you should die? Sarah doesn't think so. Cooper doesn't think so. And until you get your head straight, you don't get a vote." Ryan looked at the bowl. He thought of the old woman, her shaking hands, her poverty, and her generosity. He thought of the dog who had warmed him in the snow and now comforted him in his shame. Tears fell again, landing in the porridge, but this time they weren't tears of self-pity. They were tears of gratitude. He took a bite. It was bland, hot, and the best thing he had ever tasted. "Eat," Jack said, patting Cooper's flank as the dog settled back down, his job done. "You've got a debt to pay to that lady, and you can't pay it if you're dead." The weeks that followed the storm were a blur of agony and exhausting repetition, a purgatory that Ryan had to walk through to leave his hell behind. Detox was not a single event, but a daily war fought in the trenches of the nervous system, where the enemy was the shaking of his own hands and the phantom taste of whiskey on his tongue. Jack, true to his military roots, did not offer pity. He offered regimen. The routine was immutable. Wake at Save 100, clean the container, run the perimeter of the scrapyard until lungs burned and legs felt like lead, and then work. Labor was the medicine. Ryan, whose hands had once only known the weight of crystal tumblers and fountain pens, was now learning the language of iron and grease. He was still pale, his frame gaunt under the oversized work clothes Jack had scavenged for him, but the hollow, dead look in his eyes was being replaced by a sharp, feverish focus. His jet-black hair, no longer matted with the filth of the gutter, was tied back in a messy knot, revealing the sharp angles of a face that was slowly regaining its humanity. Cooper was the third officer in this rehabilitation unit. The German shepherd, whose arthritis seemed to ease slightly with the warmer spring air, took it upon himself to act as Ryan's shadow. If Ryan's hands shook too violently while holding a wrench, Cooper would nudge his leg, a grounding physical contact that snapped the young man back to the present. The dog didn't judge. He simply existed alongside Ryan, a silent anchor in the storm of withdrawal. The turning point came on a Tuesday, under a sky that threatened rain. A massive dump truck rumbled through the gates of the scrapyard, driven by one of Vance's unhappy employees. It backed up near the sorting piles and unloaded a chaotic avalanche of electronic waste, broken servers, smashed industrial control panels, and tangled nests of wiring ripped from a defunct factory. Vance arrived shortly after in his spotless SUV, stepping out to survey the pile with a look of utter disdain. He wore a new suit, a garish electric blue that clashed violently with the rust-colored surroundings, and he held a handkerchief to his nose as if the smell of honest work offended him. "Garbage!" Vance spat, kicking a piece of green circuit board with his polished shoe. "It's all useless. Stripped copper is the only thing worth a damn here. Jack, get the kid to smash these boards. Extract the gold pins if you can, but crush the rest. I want this cleared by sunset." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned on his heel, assuming his orders were the word of God, and retreated to his air-conditioned office trailer on the other side of the lot. Jack nodded stoically and handed Ryan a sledgehammer. "You heard the man. Smash it." Ryan took the hammer, its weight heavy in his recovering grip. He looked down at the pile Vance had dismissed as trash. Sunlight peeked through the clouds, glinting off the intricate pathways of a shattered control panel, Ryan paused. He didn't swing. He knelt, dropping the hammer into the mud, and picked up a large, rectangular circuit board. It was covered in grime, casing cracked, but Ryan's eyes, dark and usually guarded, suddenly lit up with a frightening intensity. He wiped the mud away with his thumb, revealing the serial numbers on the chips. His breathing changed, becoming shallow and fast. Not from panic this time, but from recognition. "Wait," Ryan whispered. He looked up at Jack, his voice trembling with excitement. "Jack, stop. Don't smash this." Jack paused, leaning on his shovel. "It's orders, Ryan. Vance wants it gone." Ryan shook his head frantically, scrambling over the pile like a crab, pulling out specific components. A programmable logic controller, PLC, a variable frequency drive, and a heavy-duty sensor array. "Vance is an idiot," Ryan said, his voice gaining strength. "This isn't trash. This is an Allen Bradley industrial controller. It's practically bulletproof. The factory probably just upgraded their firmware and tossed the hardware. But the logic gates, the capacitors, they're still good." For the first time, Jack saw the ghost of the man Ryan used to be. Or perhaps the man he was meant to be. The addict was gone. The engineer had arrived. "Can you make it work?" Jack asked, his gravelly voice filled with skepticism, but also curiosity. Ryan stood up, holding the circuit board like a holy relic. "I can do better than make it work," he said, a grin breaking through the grime on his face. "I can repurpose it." For the next 3 nights, the container became a laboratory. The smell of WD-40 was replaced by the acrid metallic tang of burning solder. Jack watched in silence as Ryan transformed. The shaking in Ryan's hands vanished the moment he picked up a soldering iron. He worked with a surgeon's precision, bypassing fried circuits, bridging connections with scavenged copper wire, and rewriting code on an ancient laptop Jack had bartered for years ago. Cooper lay under the workbench, resting his chin on Ryan's foot, occasionally sneezing at the smoke. Ryan talked while he worked, a stream of consciousness about voltage, resistance, and logic, flows that Jack didn't fully understand, but he understood the passion behind it. "Vance sees plastic and metal," Ryan muttered, his eyes reflected in the magnifying glass. "But this is a brain. It just needs a new body." By Friday, the pile of trash had been transformed. Ryan had cobbled together a rugged, automated irrigation control system, capable of monitoring soil moisture and adjusting water flow with industrial precision. It looked ugly, housed in a waterproof ammo box Jack had saved, but inside, it was a masterpiece of engineering. Jack called in a favor from an old contact, a struggling soy farmer named Miller, who lived 2 towns over. When Miller arrived, skeptical and tired, Ryan hooked the device up to a test pump. It worked flawlessly. The sensors read the damp earth, the relays clicked with a satisfying thunk, and the pump roared to life, modulating its pressure perfectly. Miller was stunned. "A system like this from John Deere cost me $5,000, the farmer said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I can't afford that." Ryan looked at Jack. Jack looked at Ryan. $500, Jack said. "And a side of beef." Miller paid cash on the spot, shaking Ryan's hand with a grip that spoke of genuine respect. The victory was short-lived, however, because nothing in the scrapyard happened without Vance knowing. The following afternoon, Vance drove up just as Jack and Ryan were sharing a celebratory meal, steaks from the side of beef Miller had delivered. Vance stopped his SUV and walked over, his eyes narrowing as he saw the mood. It wasn't the sullen silence he was used to. It was contentment. "You look happy for 2 bums living in a box," Vance sneered, flicking ash from his cigar onto the clean gravel. "Did you clear that electronic waste?" Jack continued cutting his steak, his movements deliberate. "It's gone, Vance." Vance smirked. "Good. Scraps for scraps." Ryan, however, couldn't hold his tongue. The pride of his creation was still burning in his chest. "We didn't smash it," Ryan said calmly, not looking up from his plate. "We fixed it. Sold it to a farmer who needed it." Vance froze. The cigar paused halfway to his mouth. "You what?" He stepped closer, his shadow falling over their small table. "You sold my property?" Ryan put down his fork and looked up. For the first time, he looked Vance in the eye without fear. "You called it garbage. You ordered it destroyed. I turned your garbage into $500. You should be thanking me for saving it from the landfill." Vance's face turned a mottled shade of red. It wasn't just the money, though his greed was instantly triggered. It was the audacity. "Hand it over," Vance demanded, holding out a fleshy hand. "Every cent. That was my material." Jack stood up then, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "The deal was for scrap, Vance. You got your scrap value deducted from my pay last week. What the boy creates from your trash is his business." Vance looked between the two men. He saw the old, crippled soldier standing like a stone wall, and he saw the young, recovering addict sitting with a newfound confidence. But what enraged him most was not the defiance. It was the dynamic. He saw Ryan look at Jack, not with the fear of an employee, but with the reverence of a soldier looking at his commanding officer. Vance, with all his money and suits, had never commanded that kind of respect. He was hated, and he knew it. "You think you're smart, don't you, boy?" Vance spat at Ryan, stepping into his personal space. "You think because you can twist a few wires you're better than this place? You're just a junkie Jack picked out of a gutter." Ryan stood up slowly. He was taller than Vance, and though thinner, his weeks of hard labor had put steel in his spine. "I might have been in the gutter," Ryan said, his voice quiet and dangerously calm, echoing Jack's own demeanor. "But the commander here pulled me out, and I'd rather be a junkie in his camp than a king in your castle." The word commander hung in the air like a slap in the face. Vance recoiled as if he'd been struck. He looked at Jack, who stood impassive, and then at Ryan, whose loyalty was absolute. Jealousy, hot and acidic, churned in Vance's gut. He realized then that Jack possessed something Vance could never buy: authority. And Ryan, this trash he had dismissed, was a weapon he had failed to control. "Commander," Vance mocked, his voice dripping with venom. "Isn't that sweet? Well, listen here, Commander. Since you're running a business on my land, the rent just went up. And you," he pointed a trembling finger at Ryan, "next time you touch anything on this lot, you ask me first. Or I call the cops and tell them about the drugs I'm sure you're hiding." Vance turned and marched back to his car, his tires spinning aggressively as he sped away. Cooper watched him go, letting out a short, sharp bark. Ryan sat back down, his hands trembling slightly, not from withdrawal, but from adrenaline. He looked at Jack. "I shouldn't have antagonized him," Ryan whispered. "He's going to make our lives hell." Jack poured more water into Ryan's cup. "He was going to do that anyway, son," Jack said, his eyes fixed on the dust settling in the distance. "Men like Vance don't need a reason to be cruel. They just need an audience. But you did good today. You held the line." Ryan looked at the circuit board diagram he had sketched on a napkin, then at the old soldier, the commander. It wasn't just a title anymore. It was the truth. And for the first time in his life, Ryan felt he was fighting on the right side of the war. The summons came 2 days later, not with a shout across the yard, but through the crackle of the intercom system Vance had installed to bark orders from his climate-controlled throne. "Ryan, office, now." The voice was distorted by static, but the arrogance was crystal clear. Ryan looked up from the alternator he was rebuilding. He wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag, exchanging a glance with Jack. The old soldier was sharpening a knife, his movements rhythmic and calm. "Watch your six, kid," Jack murmured, not looking up. "When a shark smiles, it's usually because he smells blood." Ryan nodded, patting Cooper on the head before stepping out of the container and walking across the gravel lot toward the double-wide trailer that served as Vance's headquarters. The office was a jarring contrast to the gritty reality of the scrapyard. It was frigidly air-conditioned and smelled of artificial pine, air freshener, masking the underlying stench of stale cigar smoke. Vance sat behind a desk that was too large for the room, made of faux mahogany that peeled at the corners. He was leaning back in a squeaking leather chair, counting a stack of cash with wet thumbs. Standing in the corner was Grover, Vance's head of security and personal enforcer. Grover was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4" with a neck that seemed to have swallowed his chin. He had a shaved head that glistened under the fluorescent lights and a jagged scar running from his left ear to his collarbone, a souvenir from a bar fight that had cost him his badge years ago. Grover wore a tight black t-shirt that emphasized his steroid-enhanced biceps, and he looked at Ryan with a dead, shark-like stare of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain for a paycheck. "Sit," Vance commanded, gesturing to a plastic chair without looking up from his money. Ryan remained standing. "I prefer to stand." "What do you want, Vance?" Vance chuckled, finally dropping the cash onto the desk. He spun his chair around, clasping his hands behind his head. Straight to business. I like that. You've got a brain, Ryan. I've been watching you. That irrigation thing you built, smart. Too smart for a junkie living in a shipping container. Vance leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I've got a proposition for you. My current operations manager is incompetent. I'm firing him. I want you to take the spot. Ryan blinked, surprised despite himself. You want to hire me? Vance nodded vigorously. $2,000 a week, cash. You get a real apartment, not that metal coffin. You get a company truck. You get a life back. Ryan looked at the cash on the desk. It was more money than he had seen in months. It was a ticket out of the cold, out of the hunger. What's the catch? Ryan asked, his eyes narrowing. Vance smiled, revealing teeth stained yellow by tobacco. No catch. Just responsibilities. I need someone who understands numbers. We've got a digital scale system for the incoming scrap metal. Sometimes the calibration gets drifted. I need someone to ensure the software always reads about 10% lighter than the actual weight. Just a little tweak in the code. You can do that, right? Ryan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It wasn't a job offer, it was an invitation to a criminal conspiracy. Vance wanted him to rob the desperate scavengers who brought in metal to survive, people like Sarah. You want me to steal from the customers, Ryan stated flatly. Vance waved his hand dismissively. It's not stealing, it's overhead management, but there's one more condition. Vance's face hardened, his eyes losing their fake warmth. You cut the cord with Jack, completely. You move out today, and you don't speak to him again. I don't want that crippled, self-righteous relic hanging around my new manager. He's dead weight, Ryan. A loser. He's dragging you down into the mud with him. You stick with him, you'll end up just like him, broken and forgotten. The silence in the room was heavy. Grover shifted in the corner, cracking his knuckles, a subtle threat underlining the offer. Ryan looked at Vance, really looked at him, and saw a man so hollowed out by greed that he couldn't recognize loyalty if it hit him in the face. He thought of Jack, who had shared his last piece of bread. He thought of Cooper, who had warmed him in the snow. Ryan took a step forward, leaning his hands on Vance's desk. No, he said softly. Vance blinked. Excuse me? Ryan's voice rose, steady and cold. I said no. I won't cook your books. And I definitely won't abandon the man who saved my life. Vance's face turned a mottled shade of purple. You're making a mistake, boy. Look at you. You're nothing without my charity. Ryan laughed, a short, sharp sound. Charity? You exploit everyone here. And as for Jack, Ryan straightened up, looking down at the man in the cheap suit. That broken relic has more honor in his bad leg than you have in your entire body. Jack has a soul. You just have a pile of rust and stolen money. That old man has more integrity than this entire scrapyard combined. The insult landed like a slap. Vance stood up so fast his chair tipped over. His ego, fragile as glass, shattered instantly. Get out! Vance screamed, spit flying from his lips. You think you're better than me? You ungrateful little rat. Grover! The massive security guard stepped forward, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. Throw them out! Vance hissed, his eyes bulging. Both of them, tonight, right now. Ryan turned and walked out, his heart pounding, but his head held high. He made it back to the container just as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the metal piles. Jack was waiting. He took one look at Ryan's face and knew. Pack up, Jack said quietly. We're moving out. They didn't have much time. 10 minutes later, Vance's SUV skidded to a halt outside the container, followed by a police cruiser. Vance stepped out, pointing a shaking finger at Jack. That's him, officer. That's the thief. Two bored-looking patrol officers stepped out. Vance held up a bag of catalytic converters he had clearly retrieved from his own warehouse. I found these stashed behind his container, thousands of dollars in stolen parts. I want them off my property immediately. It was a clumsy, obvious frame-up, but Jack knew how the world worked. A homeless veteran and a recovering addict against a business owner? There was no trial here. Jack looked at the officers, then at Vance. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply whistled for Cooper. "We're leaving, officer," Jack said, his voice calm. "No need for the cuffs." Vance stepped forward, a triumphant sneer on his face. "And don't think you're getting paid for this month," he spat. "That money covers the damages and the theft." He had stolen their livelihood, their home, and their reputation in one stroke. Jack picked up his duffel bag, slung it over his shoulder, and looked Vance in the eye. "You can keep the money, Vance," Jack said, the steel in his voice making the other man flinch. "It's the only thing you'll ever have." Jack, Ryan, and Cooper walked out of the main gate under the harsh glare of the floodlights. It began to rain, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked them instantly. As they reached the road, Ryan looked back at the closed gate. He felt a surge of rage, but then he felt Jack's hand on his shoulder. "Eyes front, Ryan," Jack ordered gently. "The terrain has changed. We adapt, we overcome, but we don't look back." They walked into the darkness, homeless once again, stripped of everything but their dignity and each other. The rain in Detroit doesn't wash things clean. It just makes the grime slicker, turning the city into a blurred watercolor of gray concrete and neon reflections. Jack, Ryan, and Cooper walked for 3 miles in the downpour, the adrenaline of the confrontation with Vance slowly seeping away, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. They were no longer employees or tenants. They were vagrants. Jack led the way, his limp more pronounced in the damp cold, heading not toward the overpasses where the other homeless gathered, but toward the pulsating yellow sign of the Greyhound bus terminal on Howard Street. Inside, the terminal was a purgatory of fluorescent lights, and the smell of diesel fumes mixed with floor wax and despair. It was Rs 200 hours, the graveyard shift of the city's transit system. Jack found a secluded bench in the corner, away from the prying eyes of security. "Sit," he commanded softly. Ryan collapsed onto the hard plastic seat, shivering violently, his wet clothes clinging to his skin like a second, freezing skin. Cooper shook himself, sending a spray of water across the floor, then immediately lay across Ryan's feet, acting as a living heater. Jack didn't sit. He stood, watching the schedule board click over, his mind racing through tactical assessments. He looked at Ryan, really looked at him. The boy was exhausted, defeated, and terrified. But under the fear, Jack saw the spark that had reignited over the last few weeks. He saw the engineer who had turned trash into treasure. He saw a future. And he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had seen too much death, that if Ryan stayed on the streets of Detroit with him, that spark would be extinguished within a month. The cold, the hunger, or the relapse would kill him. Jack turned his back to Ryan and unzipped the inner lining of his heavy military surplus field jacket. With a small pocket knife, he slid open a hidden seam near the hem. His fingers fished out a tightly rolled, plastic-wrapped bundle. It wasn't a fortune, but it was everything he had, $800. It was his break glass in case of emergency fund, money he had hoarded from odd jobs and scrap metal sales over 5 years, intended for a medical emergency or perhaps a decent burial. He stared at the cash for a second, feeling the weight of the sacrifice. This money was his safety net. Without it, he was truly walking a tightrope without a wire. But he looked back at the bench, at the boy who had defended his honor against a tyrant, and the decision was made. Jack walked to the ticket counter. The agent behind the glass was a woman named Bernice, a heavy-set matron with tired eyes and hair dyed a defiant shade of burgundy that clashed with her blue uniform. She was reading a paperback romance novel and chewing gum with a rhythmic, indifferent snap. She looked up as Jack approached, her gaze flicking over his wet clothes and the grim set of his jaw. "Help you?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of secondhand smoke. "One ticket," Jack said, his voice steady. "One way. San Jose, California, or as close to Silicon Valley as you can get," Bernice typed on her keyboard, her long acrylic nails clicking like hail on a tin roof. "Bus leaves in 40 minutes, transfers in Chicago and Denver. It's a long haul, honey." Jack slid the damp bills under the glass partition. "He can handle it." When Jack returned to the bench holding the ticket, Ryan looked up, confused. "What's that? Are we going somewhere?" Jack held the envelope out. "Not we, you." Ryan took the ticket, reading the destination, and his eyes widened in horror. He stood up, knocking Cooper's head gently aside. "California? No, No way, Jack. I'm not going. Ryan shoved the ticket back toward Jack's chest. I'm not leaving you here. We're a team. You said it yourself. We hold the line. Panic was rising in his voice, the old fear of abandonment surfacing. I can work here. We can find another scrapyard. I can fix things. Jack caught Ryan's wrists, holding them firm. Listen to me! Jack's voice was a low growl that cut through Ryan's hysteria. Look at yourself, Ryan. You're a racehorse trying to live in a mule's pen. You have a gift. You saw patterns in that circuit board that no one else saw. You built a machine out of garbage. There is no future for you in a Detroit gutter. If you stay here, Vance wins. If you stay here, the bottle wins. Ryan shook his head, tears mixing with the rain on his face. I don't care about the future. You saved my life. I can't just get on a bus and leave you to this. He gestured helplessly at the grim terminal, at Jack's limping leg, at the poverty that awaited them outside. It's wrong. Jack softened his grip. He looked down at Cooper. The dog was watching them, his head cocked, sensing the separation. Jack knew he needed more than logic. He needed a bond that couldn't be broken by distance. Slowly, Jack reached up to his own neck. He pulled out a chain from under his thermal shirt. It jangled softly, a sound Ryan had heard every morning when Jack washed his face, a sound of consistency and history. 2 dull stainless steel tags hung from the chain, dented and worn smooth by decades of friction against skin and fabric. Jack undid the clasp. Do you know what these are? Jack asked quietly. Ryan nodded, swallowing hard. Your dog tags. Jack held them up, the fluorescent light catching the stamped letters. Jackson, T, USMC, OPAS. I haven't taken these off since 1998, Jack said. They traveled through sandstorms, firefights, and hospitals. They are the only thing I have left that proves I was someone, that I served. He stepped closer to Ryan. I'm not giving you charity, Ryan, and I'm not firing you. Jack placed the chain around Ryan's neck. The metal was warm from Jack's body heat. I am giving you a mission. Ryan looked down at the tags resting on his dirty t-shirt. They felt heavy, heavier than lead. A mission? He whispered. Jack nodded, his face hardening into the expression of a commanding officer briefing his best soldier. This is collateral, a loan. You are going to California. You are going to find a job in a tech firm. You are going to use that brain of yours to build things, not destroy yourself. And you are going to succeed. Jack paused, his voice cracking slightly before regaining its steel. And when you have succeeded, not if, but when, you are going to come back and return these to me. That is the order. You hold these for me. You keep them safe, and you bring them home. Ryan gripped the tags, his knuckles white. The weight of the metal against his chest felt like a heartbeat. It was a brilliant tactical maneuver. Jack knew Ryan would never abandon the tags. To keep the tags safe, Ryan had to keep himself safe. To return them, Ryan had to survive and thrive. You really believe I can do it? Ryan asked, his voice small. Jack smiled, a rare, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I know you can. Cooper knows you can. Now, get your gear. The loudspeaker crackled. Service 405 to Chicago, connecting to West Coast, now boarding at Gate 4. The finality of the announcement hung in the air. Ryan grabbed his meager duffel bag. He knelt down one last time in front of Cooper. The old German shepherd whined, a high-pitched sound of distress, and licked Ryan's face frantically, sensing the departure. Ryan buried his face in the dog's fur, smelling the wet wool and loyalty. I'll come back for you, buddy, Ryan whispered into the dog's ear. I promise. I'll buy you the biggest steak in the world. He stood up, wiping his eyes. He looked at Jack, wanting to hug him, but seeing the rigid military posture Jack had assumed. Instead, Ryan straightened his own back. He reached up, clutched the dog tags, and gave Jack a sharp, respectful nod. I won't let you down, Commander. Jack returned the nod, a single sharp dip of his chin. Move out, soldier. Ryan turned and walked toward the gate. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked back, he would crumble. He handed his ticket to the driver and stepped onto the bus, the smell of stale air and upholstery swallowing him. He found a window seat on the right side. As the heavy diesel engine roared to life and the bus began to back out, Ryan pressed his hand against the cold glass. Outside, standing under the flickering yellow light of the platform, stood Jack and Cooper. The old man was standing at attention, saluting. Cooper was sitting beside him, watching the bus with unblinking amber eyes. As the bus pulled away, merging into the rainy night, Ryan felt the dog tags vibrating against his chest with the hum of the engine. He wasn't just a passenger, he was a man on a mission, and he would die before he failed to complete it. 3 winters had scraped their icy knuckles across Detroit since the bus pulled away, each one leaving deeper scars on the city and on Jack. Time, when lived on the concrete, does not pass linearly. It erodes. Jack was now 55, but the mirror of a shop window revealed a man who looked 70. His hair had transitioned from steel gray to the stark, brittle white of old bone, and his posture, once rigidly upright, now carried a permanent hunch, as if the weight of the sky had finally become too heavy to bear. He no longer lived in the relative safety of the shipping container. Vance had bulldozed that sanctuary a week after evicting them. Now, Jack's address was the Underpass, a cavernous, windswept cathedral of concrete beneath the I-75 interchange. It was a place of shadows and damp echoes, where the sun only visited in slanted, dusty beams for an hour a day. Yet, even here, Jack had carved out a perimeter of order. His home was a 3-walled structure cobbled together from discarded plywood, corrugated plastic sheets, and a heavy canvas tarp he had scavenged from a construction dumpster. Inside, it was swept clean. There was no clutter, only the bare essentials of survival arranged with military precision. But the center of Jack's world was no longer just survival. It was the smell of yeast. To maintain his dignity and feed Cooper, Jack had reinvented himself. He had built a makeshift oven out of a discarded oil drum and lined it with bricks. Every morning at 300 hours, while the city slept, Jack would mix flour, water, and salt, bought with the few coins he scraped together, and bake. He became the bread man of the Underpass. Cooper was the heart that kept this fragile existence beating, but that heart was laboring. At 13 years old, the German Shepherd was ancient. The arthritis that had once been a stiffness was now a crippling fusion of his hips. His back legs dragged slightly when he walked, and his eyes, though still burning with amber intelligence, were clouded with the milky film of cataracts. He spent most of his days lying on a bed made of 3 layers of cardboard and an old sleeping bag, watching Jack knead dough. Jack's own leg was agony. The cold dampness of the underpass made the shrapnel wounds flare up like fire, but he ignored it. Every cent of profit from the dense, crusty rolls he sold to construction workers went into a jar labeled Coop. It bought high-grade glucosamine supplements and pain relief chews for the dog. Jack ate the burnt crusts and drank tap water so Cooper could have soft food that didn't hurt his old teeth. They were a pair of fading soldiers, holding the line against oblivion. The community of the underpass was a motley collection of lost souls, but to Jack, they were a platoon. Among them was Elena, a woman who ruled the corner of 3rd Street. Elena was in her late 30s, though the harsh neon lights of her profession made her look older. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of mahogany and hair that she dyed a fierce electric purple. She wore a fake leopard print coat that had seen better decades, wrapping it around herself like armor. Elena was tough, her tongue sharp enough to strip paint, but she had a soft spot for the bread man. She would often stop by Jack's lean-to after her shift, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Eat, old man," she would say, dropping a foil-wrapped sandwich or a carton of milk on his crate. "You're too skinny. You look like a scarecrow made of jerky." Jack would nod his thanks, never judging her, never asking questions. Then there was little Marcus, a 12-year-old shoeshine boy who should have been in school, but was instead hustling for coins to feed a mother who couldn't get out of bed. Marcus was small for his wire-thin frame, with eyes that were too big and too old for his face. He carried a wooden shoeshine box that Jack had repaired for him, reinforcing the hinges with scrap metal. Marcus idolized Jack. He would sit by the oil drum oven, watching the bread rise, listening to Jack's sparse stories about discipline and honor. "When I grow up," Marcus would say, popping a piece of warm bread into his mouth, "I'm going to buy a house. And you and Cooper can live in the garage. It'll be heated." Jack would smile, a cracking of his weathered face. "Focus on your shine, Marcus. The house comes later." But the streets are predatory, and weakness attracts wolves. It was a Tuesday night in November, the air biting with the first frost, when the equilibrium of the underpass was shattered. Jack was banking the fire in his drum oven, the orange glow illuminating the steam of his breath. Cooper was asleep, letting out soft, wheezing snores. 3 figures emerged from the shadows of the access tunnel. They weren't locals. They were tourists from a tougher gang downriver, looking to expand territory or just looking for victims to bruise. They wore leather jackets that creaked in the cold and smelled of cheap menthols and aggression. The leader, a man with a shaved head and a neck tattoo of a scorpion, kicked over Jack's bucket of water. The splash woke Cooper, who tried to rise, his back legs scrambling uselessly on the cardboard before he managed to haul himself up, growling a low, guttural warning that lacked its old power. "Shut that mud up," the scorpion hissed, stepping into the light. He looked at Jack's meager setup, at the jar of coins, at the bread. "You're in our spot, old man. This tunnel belongs to the kings now. You pay tax or you bleed." Jack stood up, grabbing his heavy iron poker from the fire. His knee buckled, but he locked it. "This is public land," Jack said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline dumping into his tired system. "Move along!" The scorpion laughed, pulling a switchblade. The click of the blade was loud in the echo chamber of the bridge. "I don't think I will. Grab the jar," he ordered his 2 lackeys. One of them lunged for the money. Cooper, ignoring his pain, threw himself forward, snapping his jaws at the intruder's hand. He moved slower than before, and the thug easily sidestepped, kicking the old dog hard in the ribs. Cooper yelped, a sound that tore Jack's heart in 2, and collapsed, struggling to breathe. "No!" Jack roared, swinging the poker. He struck one thug on the shoulder, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. The scorpion grabbed Jack's arm, twisting it until the poker clattered to the ground, and shoved him hard against the concrete pillar. Jack slid down, gasping, his vision swimming. The thugs surrounded him, grinning. They were going to beat him, take the medicine money, and maybe kill the dog just for sport. Jack closed his eyes, preparing for the end, his hand reaching out to touch Cooper's fur one last time. Then a voice rang out, sharp, loud, and furious. "Hey, ugly!" It was Elena. She was standing at the entrance of the lean-to, holding a broken glass bottle in one hand and a can of pepper spray in the other. Her purple hair seemed to vibrate with rage. "You touch him, and I will blind you." The scorpion turned, sneering. "Go away, whore. This isn't your business." But he was wrong. It was her business. Behind Elena, the shadows began to move. Little Marcus stepped out, holding a heavy metal pipe he had scavenged. Behind him came Crazy Tom, a homeless veteran who usually spoke to invisible people but was now glaring at the thugs with lucid, terrifying focus. Then came the others, the window washers, the can collectors, the street girls, 10 of them, 15. They emerged from their cardboard boxes and sleeping bags like a rising tide. They didn't have guns. They had rocks, bottles, sticks, and sheer overwhelming numbers. They formed a wall between the thugs and Jack. They were the discarded people, the invisible ones. But tonight, they were a phalanx. "You didn't hear the lady," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking but fierce. "She said get out!" The scorpion looked at the angry mob. He looked at Elena's bottle, at Tom's crazy eyes, at the sheer number of people willing to bleed for an old man who baked bread. The calculation changed. Predators don't like fair fights, and they certainly don't like fighting a swarm. "Whatever," the scorpion spat, retracting his blade. "This place smells like piss anyway." He signaled his men, and they backed away, retreating into the darkness from which they came. The moment they were gone, the wall of people collapsed inward, turning into a circle of care. Elena dropped her bottle and rushed to Jack, helping him sit up. "You okay, bread man?" she asked, her tough veneer cracking. Jack nodded, breathless, and crawled over to Cooper. The dog was wheezing, but licking Jack's hand. He was bruised, but nothing was broken. "He kicked him," Jack whispered, his voice trembling with rage and relief. "He kicked my dog." "We got him, Jack," Marcus said, kneeling down. "We got you." That night, the underpass didn't feel like a cold, concrete tomb. It felt like a home. The community didn't leave. They knew the cold was seeping into Jack's bones and that Cooper was hurting. Elena took off her fake leopard coat, her most prized possession, and draped it over Cooper. "He needs it more than me," she muttered when Jack tried to protest. Crazy Tom brought his own thermal blanket and tucked it around Jack's shoulders. Someone else brought a thermos of hot coffee. They sat around the oil drum oven, keeping vigil. These were people who fought over cigarette butts and recycling cans during the day, but tonight they shared everything. They were candles in the night, small flickering flames that, when brought together, created a bonfire of warmth that kept the darkness at bay. As Jack sat there, warmed by the bodies of his friends and the fur of his dog, his hand drifted to his chest. He felt for the dog tags that were no longer there. His mind drifted to Ryan. It had been 3 years, no letter, no visit. Jack looked at the moon hanging in the sliver of sky above the highway. He didn't feel anger. He assumed Ryan had made it. He assumed the boy was sitting in a glass office somewhere, warm, successful, and safe. If the price of Ryan's success was forgetting the old man who saved him, Jack was willing to pay it. He made it, Jack thought, closing his eyes as Cooper rested his heavy head on Jack's lap. He's safe. That's all that matters. Jack didn't know that the mission was far from over, or that the boy hadn't forgotten. He was just gathering the strength to return. But for tonight, Jack slept, protected by the only family he had left. The piece of the underpass, fragile as a spider web, was torn apart on a Tuesday morning, not by gangs or storms, but by the indifferent roar of capitalism. It started with the ground shaking, a vibration that rattled Jack's teeth and made the water in Cooper's bowl ripple. Then came the vehicles. Not the usual police cruisers doing a sweep, but heavy yellow bulldozers and black SUVs with tinted windows, moving like a funeral procession for the neighborhood. Leading the convoy was a familiar white luxury vehicle, though newer and larger than the one from years ago. It stopped right in front of Jack's lean-to, blocking the weak morning sun. The door opened and Vance stepped out. Time had not been kind to him. It had bloated him. He was heavier now, his neck spilling over the collar of a cashmere coat that cost more than Jack would earn in 10 lifetimes. His face was ruddier, a map of broken capillaries from too much expensive scotch, but his eyes were the same, beady, calculating, and utterly devoid of soul. He held a rolled-up blueprint in one hand, like a baton. He wasn't just passing through, he was claiming territory. "Clear it out!" Vance shouted to a crew of men in hard hats who were descending from a truck. "I want this area scraped clean by noon. The new parking structure starts foundation work tomorrow." He surveyed the huddled masses of homeless people with the look one gives a cockroach infestation. Then, his gaze landed on the makeshift oven and the hunched figure standing beside it. Vance paused, a slow, malicious smile spreading across his face. He walked over, his Italian leather boots crunching on the gravel. Well, Vance drawled, the sound of his voice making the hair on Jack's neck stand up. "If it isn't the commander." Jack stood rigid, placing himself between Vance and Cooper, who was lying on his cardboard bed, struggling to lift his heavy head. "Vance," Jack acknowledged, his voice like grinding stones. "We're not bothering anyone. This is city property." Vance laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Not anymore. I bought the lease rights this morning. Gentrification, Jack. It's coming for you." Vance stepped closer, invading Jack's personal space, sniffing the air. "You smell like yeast and failure. Tell me, where is your little protege? Where's the boy genius?" Vance looked around theatrically. "Did he come back for you? Did he send a limo?" Vance leaned in, his breath smelling of mince and rot. "Or did he use you and throw you away like everyone else does? He's gone, Jack. He forgot you the second he got on that bus. You're just trash to him." The words hit Jack harder than a fist. It was his deepest fear, spoken aloud by his worst enemy, but Jack didn't flinch. "He has honor," Jack said quietly. "Something you wouldn't understand." Vance's smile vanished. "Honor? Let's see how much honor is worth." He snapped his fingers at two of his workers, burly men with sledgehammers. "That oven is a fire hazard. Destroy it." Jack stepped forward, raising a hand. "Wait, that's my livelihood. You can't—" Before he could finish, the first sledgehammer swung. Clang! The sound was deafening. The oil drum oven, seasoned by years of heat and care, crumpled like tinfoil. The second blow shattered the brick lining. Dust and flour plumed into the air. Jack watched, helpless, as his only means of survival was flattened in seconds. The workers kicked over the dough rising in the bucket, trampling it into the dirt. Elena screamed from her tent. "Leave him alone, you bastards!" But she was held back by the sheer size of the construction crew. Cooper, sensing the violence and Jack's distress, tried to do what he had always done. He forced his arthritic legs to work, hauling himself up with a groan of pain. He let out a bark, hoarse, weak, but defiant, and lunged toward Vance, snapping his teeth at the air. He moved slowly, barely a threat, but Vance saw an opportunity. He recoiled, exaggerating his fear, shouting, "It's attacking me! Did you see that? It's rabid!" Cooper's legs gave out, and he collapsed, panting, unable to even reach Vance's shadow. But Vance was already pulling out his phone. "Get animal control here now!" he screamed into the receiver. "I have a dangerous, aggressive animal on my site. It attacked a civilian. I want it put down immediately. Priority 1. Jack froze, his blood turning to ice. "No," Jack whispered. "Vance, no. He's harmless. He can barely walk." Vance hung up the phone, smirking. "He's a liability, and on my property, liabilities get liquidated." The animal control van arrived with terrifying speed, as if summoned by the devil himself. The officer who stepped out was a man named Krentz. He was shaped like a fire hydrant, squat and thick, with a uniform that strained at the seams and a face that suggested he enjoyed the power his catchpole gave him. He didn't look at the dog's condition. He only listened to the man in the cashmere coat. "That's the beast," Vance pointed, lunged at my throat. "Look at it, foaming at the mouth." It was a lie. Cooper was only drooling from exhaustion and pain, but Krentz didn't care. He grabbed the long pole with the wire noose at the end and marched toward the lean-to. "Step aside, sir," Krentz barked at Jack. Jack grabbed Cooper's collar, shielding the dog with his own body. "He didn't do anything. He's 13 years old. He's crippled." Krentz shoved Jack. "Obstruction of justice. Move, or I call the cops, and you go to jail, and the dog goes to the incinerator anyway." Jack looked at the catchpole, then at Vance. He realized with a sickening clarity that physical resistance was futile. If he fought, he went to prison, and Cooper died alone in a cold cage. There was only one currency left to him. Jack turned to Vance. The old soldier, who had stood tall under mortar fire, who had never begged for a dime in his life, felt his knees tremble. He looked at Cooper's clouded eyes, full of trust. Slowly, agonizingly, Jack Jackson lowered himself. He knelt in the mud and the ruined dough. He clasped his rough, scarred hands together. "Vance," Jack pleaded, his voice cracking, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "Please, take the land, take the oven, but don't take him. He's all I have. Please, just let us go." The silence under the bridge was absolute. The construction workers looked away, uncomfortable. Elena was sobbing openly. Little Marcus clutched his shoeshine box, his knuckles white. Vance looked down at the kneeling veteran, savoring the moment. It was the victory he had wanted years ago. "Begging now, Commander?" Vance sneered. "I can't hear you." Jack bowed his head, his forehead almost touching the dirt. "I'm begging you. Please, spare the dog." Vance laughed, a sound that echoed like a gunshot. "Lower," he whispered, his voice trembling with sadistic glee. "Put your face in the dirt where you belong." It was too much. The cruelty was so naked, so unnecessary, that it snapped the invisible tension holding the crowd back. "Enough!" a voice shrieked. It was little Marcus. The boy ran forward, winding up his thin arm, and hurled a jagged piece of brick. It sailed through the air and smashed into the windshield of Vance's pristine white SUV, spiderwebbing the glass with a loud crack. The sound broke the spell. "Get him!" Elena screamed, grabbing a handful of gravel and flinging it at Vance. "Protect the bread man!" yelled Crazy Tom, charging forward with a trash can lid as a shield. Suddenly, the underpass erupted. The homeless, the hookers, the forgotten people, they surged forward. Stones, bottles, and pieces of scrap metal rained down on Vance and the animal control officer. Krentz dropped his catchpole, retreating in panic as a bottle shattered near his feet. "Get back, you crazy animals!" Vance screamed, shielding his face as a rock grazed his shoulder. "Get in the car!" Vance yelled to his driver, scrambling backward, his dignity forgotten in the face of the mob's fury. The construction workers retreated to their trucks, unwilling to fight 100 desperate people for a parking lot. The air was filled with shouting. the barking of dogs, and the sound of breaking glass. In the center of the chaos, oblivious to the stones flying over his head, Jack remained on his knees, wrapping his arms around Cooper's neck, burying his face in the dog's fur, sobbing as the community formed a human shield around them, a chaotic, violent, beautiful wall of defense against the man who tried to steal their last shred of hope. The chaos under the bridge had devolved into a desperate, dusty brawl. The air was thick with the shouts of the homeless, the thud of rocks hitting metal, and the terrified cursing of the construction crew. Krentz, the animal control officer, was not a brave man, but he was a petty one, and his humiliation fueled a dangerous, stubborn rage. While the crowd was distracted throwing debris at Vance's retreating SUV, Krentz saw his opening. He didn't care about the mob anymore. He just wanted to win this one small, cruel victory against the old man who had defied him. He lunged forward, the wire loop of his catch-pole swinging viciously toward Cooper's neck. "I'm taking this mongrel!" Krentz screamed, sweat dripping into his eyes. Jack, still on his knees, threw his body over the dog, his back exposed to the metal pole. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the blow that would break his ribs, whispering a final apology to his faithful companion. But the blow never landed. A sound tore through the cacophony of the riot. Not a siren, but a deep, resonant horn, the kind that belongs to a vehicle designed to part oceans of traffic. It was followed by the screech of heavy tires on asphalt. The timeline of the underpass seemed to freeze. The rock throwers lowered their arms. Krentz froze mid-swing, the pole trembling in his grip. Vance, who had been scrambling into his car, stopped with one foot inside, looking toward the access ramp. A convoy of 3 vehicles descended into the shadows of the underpass like sleek black sharks entering a feeding frenzy. They were massive armored SUVs with tinted windows, their polished paint reflecting the grime of the city in distorted swirls. They didn't slow down for the mud or the debris. They plowed through it with terrifying authority, boxing in Vance's white car and cutting off Krentz's escape route. The lead vehicle ground to a halt mere inches from where Jack knelt, the heat from its engine radiating against his face. Silence fell over the crowd, a heavy, suffocating silence born of confusion and awe. The doors of the SUVs opened in unison. From the rear and flank vehicles stepped 4 men in dark suits. They weren't police, and they weren't gangsters. They moved with the precise, efficient economy of private security contractors. They formed a perimeter instantly, their eyes scanning the crowd, not with hostility, but with professional detachment. Then the rear door of the center vehicle opened. A polished black boot stepped into the mud, indifferent to the filth. Ryan emerged. He was no longer the shivering skeletal boy in a ruined tuxedo who had wanted to die in the snow. He was a man forged by 3 years of relentless purpose. He stood tall, his shoulders broad and set, radiating a quiet, kinetic energy. He did not wear a suit of armor or a flashy designer ensemble to flaunt his wealth. Instead, he wore a simple, high-quality slate-gray canvas field jacket, dark jeans, and sturdy boots, clothes meant for work, for action. His hair was cut short and neat, his face clean-shaven, revealing the sharp jawline that had once been hidden by grime. But it was not his clothes that caught the light. Hanging outside his t-shirt, resting against his sternum, was a silver chain, and dangling from it were 2 battered, dull stainless steel tags, Jack's dog tags. They caught a stray beam of sunlight, piercing through the overpass, shining like holy relics against the dark fabric of his shirt. Ryan didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the security guards. His eyes, dark and burning with intensity, locked onto the kneeling figure of the old man. He began to walk. Krentz, stupid with adrenaline and confusion, stepped in his path, brandishing the catch-pole. "Back off!" Krentz yelled, though his voice wavered. "Official city business. This dog is seized." Ryan didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He simply walked through Krentz's space as if the man were a ghost. One of Ryan's security guards moved, a blur of motion, and gently but firmly grabbed the catch-pole, twisting it out of Krentz's hands and tossing it aside like a twig. Krentz stumbled back, mouth agape. Ryan reached Jack. He stopped, looking down at the man who had carried him through the snow. Jack looked up, his eyes squinting against the glare, disbelief warring with recognition in his clouded gaze. Cooper, however, knew. The old dog lifted his nose, sniffing the air. The scent of expensive soap was there, yes, but underneath it was the smell of the boy who had slept on the floor with him. Cooper let out a soft, puppy-like whine and thumped his tail once against the dirt. Ryan's composure cracked for a microsecond, a flash of pure emotion crossing his face, before he steeled himself. He reached down, offering a hand. "Commander," Ryan said, his voice deep and steady, echoing the gravelly tone Jack used to use. "Get up! We don't kneel to trash." Jack reached out, his hand trembling and stained with flour and mud. Ryan gripped it, a firm soldier's grip, and hauled Jack to his feet. He didn't let go. He pulled Jack into a brief, fierce embrace, ignoring the grime transferring to his jacket. Then Ryan stepped back. He reached out and brushed the dust from Jack's shoulders. He straightened the collar of Jack's tattered flannel shirt, with the care of a valet dressing a king. Only then did Ryan turn to face the others. Vance had stepped out of his car, his face a mask of purple rage and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" Vance demanded, trying to muster his old arrogance. "You can't just block me in. This is my land. I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Ryan turned slowly. The look he gave Vance was terrifying. It was devoid of anger. It was the look a boot gives to an ant. From the passenger seat of Ryan's SUV, a woman stepped out. This was Ms. Chen, Ryan's chief legal counsel. She was a woman of striking precision, with razor-sharp features, rimless glasses, and hair pulled back into a severe bun. She wore a tailored pantsuit that cost more than the bulldozer behind her, and she carried a thick leather portfolio. She walked through the mud on her heels with improbable balance, looking at Vance with the boredom of a predator toying with prey. "Actually, Mr. Vance," Ms. Chen said, her voice crisp and amplified by the acoustics of the tunnel, "it is not your land." She opened the portfolio and handed a document to Vance. "As of 900 hours this morning, Vance Scrap and Development LLC no longer holds the deed to this property. Your bridge loan for the parking structure project, it was serviced by chaotic high-risk lenders. My client purchased that debt yesterday." Vance snatched the paper, his hands shaking. You bought my debt? You can't just foreclose." Ryan stepped forward, his voice projecting clearly to the silent crowd. "I didn't just foreclose, Vance. I triggered the default clause. You're insolvent. This land, your equipment, that white car you're driving, it's all collateral. It belongs to me now." Vance stared at the paper, then at Ryan. Recognition finally dawned on him. The junkie, the boy from the container, the trash. Vance's face drained of color, leaving him looking gray and sickly. "You," Vance whispered, "you're the kid." Ryan took a step closer, fingering the dog tags around his neck. "I'm the investment you threw away," Ryan said coldly, "and now I'm the landlord." Ryan turned to Ms. Chen. "The eviction order for these people." Ms. Chen smiled, a thin, sharp expression. "Rescinded. We've filed for an emergency rezoning permit to designate this area as a protected community outreach zone." Ryan looked back at Vance. "Get off my property. You have 5 minutes before I have my security team remove you for trespassing, and walk." The car stays. The silence held for a heartbeat, and then it shattered. Little Marcus let out a whoop of joy that pierced the air. Elena clapped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Crazy Tom banged his trash can lid like a drum. The cheer that rose from the underpass was primal, a roar of victory from people who had never won a battle in their lives. Vance looked around, realizing he was utterly alone. His construction crew was already packing up, unwilling to cross a billionaire. Krentz was backing away toward his van, looking terrified. Vance dropped the paper in the mud. He looked at Jack, then at Ryan, hate burning in his eyes, but he said nothing. He couldn't. He was beaten. He turned and began the long, humiliating walk up the access ramp, his expensive shoes ruined, stripped of his power, his car, and his pride. Ryan didn't watch him go. He turned back to Jack. The old man was staring at the dog tags on Ryan's chest, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his cheeks. Ryan reached up and undid the clasp of the chain. He pulled the metal tags in his palm, warm, heavy, and enduring. He held them out to Jack. "You gave me a mission, Jack," Ryan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You told me to succeed. You told me to bring these back." Jack looked at the tags, then at the man holding them. He reached out with a shaking hand, his fingers brushing the stamped metal. You kept them safe, Jack whispered, his voice cracking. Every day, Ryan replied. They were the only thing that kept me going when I wanted to quit. I looked at your name, and I remembered who believed in me. Ryan gently placed the chain back around Jack's neck, fastening the clasp. He rested his hands on Jack's shoulders. Commander, Ryan said, smiling through his own welling tears. Mission accomplished. Cooper let out a bark, loud and joyous, and tried to stand on his hind legs to lick Ryan's face. Ryan laughed, kneeling down in the dirt, ignoring his expensive jeans, to hug the old dog. I promised you a steak, buddy, Ryan whispered to the dog. A big one. The crowd surged forward then, not to attack, but to celebrate. Elena hugged Jack. Marcus touched the shiny black car with awe. The bread man stood in the center of it all, feeling the weight of the dog tags against his chest. A weight that no longer felt like a burden, but like an anchor returning him to the world. He wasn't forgotten. He wasn't trash. He was a soldier who had completed his greatest operation, saving a life that had come back to save him. The fall of Vance was not a singular, dramatic explosion, but a systematic dismantling that Ryan orchestrated with the precision of a master engineer. In the weeks following the confrontation at the underpass, the full weight of Ryan's resources came crashing down on the corrupt scrapyard owner. It wasn't just about debt, it was about exposure. Ryan had spent 3 years building Phoenix E-Cycling, a multi-million-dollar tech recycling empire, but he had never forgotten the specific illegal shortcuts Vance used to squeeze profit from poverty. Ryan's legal team, led by the formidable Ms. Chen, handed the district attorney a silver platter of evidence. Forensic accounting records proving tax evasion, environmental impact reports showing illegal dumping of toxic chemicals into the city water table, and witness testimonies regarding labor violations. Vance was arrested at his country club, stripped of his flashy suit and handcuffed in front of the very elite he had desperately tried to impress. The empire built on rust and cruelty crumbled into dust, and the land was seized by the state, eventually sold at auction to a single bidder, Ryan. But Ryan didn't buy it to build a parking lot. He bought it to bury the past and build a future. 6 months later, the landscape of Jack's life had changed so drastically that he sometimes woke up afraid it was a dream. They were no longer in the gray, suffocating concrete jungle of Detroit. They were 50 miles west, where the urban sprawl gave way to the rolling green hills of the countryside. Here, on a sprawling 100-acre property that smelled of pine needles and damp earth rather than exhaust fumes, stood the Cooper's Rebirth Center. It was a facility that defied categorization, part high-tech recycling plant, part vocational school, and part sanctuary. The main building was an architectural marvel of reclaimed wood and glass, designed to let in the light that Jack had lived without for so long. Jack sat on the wide, wraparound porch of the main lodge, a heavy tartan blanket tucked around his legs to ward off the crisp autumn chill. He breathed in the air, clean, sweet, and quiet. Beside him, lying on an orthopedic memory foam bed that cost more than Vance's car, was Cooper. The old German shepherd looked different. The cloudiness in his eyes had been cleared by cataract surgery, restoring the sharp, amber intelligence of his gaze. His hips, once fused by agony, now moved with a fluid grace thanks to a double hip replacement performed by the state's top veterinary surgeons. He wasn't a puppy again. He was still an old soldier with white fur frosting his muzzle, but the pain was gone. Cooper let out a deep, contented sigh, resting his heavy head on Jack's knee, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the cushion. Jack rested his hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth, his own fingers no longer cracked and bleeding from the cold, but healing, just like his soul. The activity in the yard below the porch was a symphony of productivity. Ryan had moved the headquarters of Phoenix E-Cycling here, but he had done something radical with the workforce. He didn't hire corporate drones, he hired the discarded. Walking across the courtyard with a clipboard in hand was Elena. Gone was the electric purple hair and the desperate leopard print armor of the streetwalker. She now wore a crisp navy blue polo shirt with the company logo, a phoenix rising from a circuit board, and khaki trousers. Her hair was its natural dark brown, pulled back in a professional ponytail, revealing a face that was striking in its strength and dignity. She was the personnel manager, running the logistics of the intake center with the same fierce protectiveness she had once used to guard her street corner. She spotted Jack on the porch and waved, a genuine, radiant smile transforming her features. She was no longer surviving, she was thriving. Nearby, Crazy Tom was working in the sorting bay. It turned out that the obsessive focus that made him talk to invisible people also made him a genius at dismantling complex motherboards. In a quiet, structured environment, his mind had found a rhythm. He wasn't crazy here, he was a specialist. But the centerpiece of this new world was unfolding right in front of Jack. At a sturdy wooden workbench set up on the grass to catch the afternoon sun, sat Ryan and little Marcus. Ryan had traded his field jacket for rolled-up sleeves, revealing the faint scars of his past on his forearms. He was holding a soldering iron, the thin wisp of smoke curling up into the blue sky. Marcus, the former shoeshine boy, sat next to him, wearing safety goggles that were slightly too big for his face, his expression one of intense, tongue-biting concentration. Marcus was clean, fed, and safe, his thin frame filling out with regular meals. "Steady," Ryan's voice drifted up to the porch, calm and patient. The exact tone Jack had used with him years ago. "Don't force the solder. Heat the joint, let it flow. It has to want to connect." Marcus nodded, his hand trembling slightly. He touched the wire to the board. The silver liquid flashed, creating a perfect shiny bead. "I did it!" Marcus shouted, pulling off his goggles. "Look, Ryan, it held!" Ryan grinned, clapping the boy on the shoulder. "Perfect connection, soldier. That's a Class A repair. You keep doing that, and you'll be running the engineering department by the time you're 20. Jack watched them, a lump forming in his throat. He saw the symmetry of it all. The circle was complete. Years ago, in a freezing container, Jack had taken a broken, suicidal boy and given him a purpose. He had taught him discipline, honor, and the value of fixing things. Now, that boy had become a man who fixed the world. Ryan wasn't just recycling electronics, he was recycling lives. He was taking people the world called trash, the addicts, the homeless, the broken, and finding the gold hidden inside their circuits. He was giving them what Jack had given him, a second chance. Ryan looked up then, catching Jack's eye. He said something to Marcus, who ran off to show his soldered board to Elena. Ryan walked up the steps to the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He sat on the railing, looking out over the facility he had built. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the green fields where dozens of rescued dogs, Cooper's new pack, were running and playing. "Vance got sentenced today," Ryan said quietly. 10 years, federal prison, no parole. Jack nodded slowly. He felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of balance restored. "Justice is a slow wheel," Jack murmured, "but it grinds fine." Ryan looked at Jack, his gaze dropping to the dog tags that Jack now wore outside his sweater. "Are you happy, Commander? Is this okay?" Ryan gestured to the sprawling estate, the wealth, the comfort. He still carried that insecurity, the fear that he hadn't done enough to repay the debt. Jack smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. He looked at Cooper, sleeping pain-free. He looked at Elena, laughing with Tom. He looked at Marcus, who was holding his circuit board up to the sky like a trophy. And finally, he looked at Ryan, the son he never had, the legacy he never expected. "Ryan," Jack said softly, "I gave a bowl of porridge to a starving kid. I gave a blanket to a shivering stranger. I gave a dog tag to a scared young man." Jack gestured to the hundreds of people working below, the families reunited, the lives saved. "I saved one life, and you took that one act and saved hundreds. You didn't just return the investment, son. You multiplied it." Jack leaned back, closing his eyes as the last rays of the sun warmed his face. "I'm not just happy, Ryan. I'm complete." Ryan smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. He reached out and rested his hand on Jack's shoulder, while Cooper shifted in his sleep, laying his paw over Ryan's boot. The three of them sat there in the silence of the twilight. The old soldier, the loyal dog, and the boy who came back. They were no longer fighting the cold, they were the fire. And from the ashes of the scrapyard, they had built a warmth that would never go out. The story of Jack, Ryan, and Cooper serves as a powerful testament that kindness is never a wasted investment. In a world that can often feel cold and indifferent, the quiet sacrifice of an old soldier and the fierce loyalty of a disabled dog planted seeds of hope that grew into a forest of shelter for the forgotten. When Jack handed over his dog tags, his last symbol of honor, he didn't realize he was saving a life that would eventually return to save his own community. This teaches us a profound lesson that you do not need wealth to be a benefactor. Sometimes a warm meal, a steady hand, or simply the gift of belief is enough to rewrite a destiny. Many might call Ryan's return luck, but I believe it was a miracle. A miracle isn't always the parting of seas. Often it is disguised in the most ordinary forms, like the bark of a dog in a storm, the patience of a stranger, or the return of a prodigal son. Perhaps God doesn't always come down to earth to help us directly. Instead, He uses the hands of those around us to perform His good work. So, never lose hope, for your reinforcements may already be on their way, arriving in ways you least expect. If this story touched your heart or restored your faith in humanity, please don't keep this feeling to yourself. Share this video to spread the light of compassion to those who might be walking through their own dark winter. Leave a comment saying, "I believe," or "Amen," to affirm that kindness still wins in the end. Please subscribe to join our community, where we honor the good in the world every day. May God bless you and your family with peace, health, and abundance. Keep sowing seeds of kindness, for the harvest is sure to come.